The Tudor History and Travel Show is a podcast that brings Tudor history to life by exploring Tudor places and artefacts in the flesh. You will be travelling through time with Sarah Morris, the Tudor travel guide, uncovering the stories behind some of the most amazing Tudor locations and objects in the UK. Because when you visit a Tudor building, it is only time and not space which separates you from the past. And now over to your host, Sarah Morris.
Hello, my time-travelling friends. It's Sarah here, the Tudor Travel Guide. Welcome back to this second episode in a series of 3 that I have recorded on location to commemorate the anniversary of the Battle of Bosworth Field on the 22nd of August, 1485. In the first episode, we explored the run-up to the battle by visiting Leicester city centre and touring some of the places associated with Richard's time in the city as he prepared to meet Henry Tudor on the battlefield. In this episode, you will find me at Bosworth battlefield itself, and shortly I will be joined by our expert guide for the day, Harry Marr. But first, I wanted to drop in at a very special, very peaceful location, quite close to the battlefield, to share a very personal story. So, let's not tarry any longer, my friends. Let's go time travelling. It's the morning of the 22nd of August, 1485, the morning of the battle. And you join me actually in the very small village of Sutton Cheney. This time I'm alone because I have come to visit a church, the Church of St. James, the parish church here in the village, where it is said that King Richard heard his final mass in preparation for the battle. So let's walk together up the path towards the church. It's a small church, it's right in front of me, just a very small parish church, stone built, a small squat tower, completely unassuming if it wasn't for the historic events that took place here in 1485. So let's just go inside and see if we can pick up any vibe. Okay, so here we are inside the church, as you can probably tell. It's not a particularly remarkable church, but one of the first things that you see when you come inside is directly opposite the door is a plaque, which was placed here by the Richard III Society. And we have the royal coat of arms, and it says, "Remember before God, Richard III, King of England, and those who fell at Bosworth Field having kept faith, 22nd of August, 1485. And of course it has Richard's motto, "Loyauté me lie," at the bottom of it, and his white roses of York. Now, for those of you who are interested in the paranormal, I have a story for you about this church, and it's a very personal story. Now, I totally get it. This might not be your thing. But nevertheless, if it is, I thought I'd share it with you because several years ago when I visited this church, I came here alone, and a very unexpected and quite startling event happened which has left a real impression upon me. I was walking up the nave towards the high altar, just as I am now, standing right in front of the high altar. And it was deadly silent, as you can hear. And in my mind, I was musing on the events of that morning of August, the 22nd, 1485. And I decided I'd ask Richard how he felt, knowing that actually this was the place that he is said to have come and no doubt knelt before the high altar, just exactly where I am today. And I asked him, how did he feel? Was he scared? And quite spookily, quite from nowhere, a man's voice replied to me in quite decisive masculine tones that no, he wasn't afraid, because he knew he was the rightful king of England. Now, a shiver certainly went up my spine. I have no idea where that voice came from, but it was as real to me as if I was speaking to you, and I felt a real presence. So that's my very, very personal story and my connection here with Sutton Chaney, and one of the reasons why I wanted to come here today. Now, the church lies just about a mile away from the battle site, not much further. And of course, that is where we are going to go next, because Richard, along with his supporters, if they did pray here and hear Mass, were bound for Bosworth, where, of course, he would finally meet Henry Tudor on the battlefield. So I invite you to come with me to continue our story and to unfold the events of that particularly bloody but decisive morning. So we have come, just about a mile or so along the road from Sutton Chaney to the Bosworth Battlefield Heritage Centre. And I am joined this morning by Harry Marr, who's going to be our guest today. Hello, Harry.
Hi, good morning.
Thank you so much for being our guide.
It's a pleasure.
Oh, yes. So I would say we're here on a very cold day. We're just hoping it's not going to rain on us as we walk around here today. But before we get going and unpack this part of the story, which is, of course, where all the action happened, we've been building up to that by talking about Richard's arrival in Leicester and his departure from the town as he headed westwards towards this site. Before we get to talk about those events, perhaps you could just introduce yourself for our listeners.
I'm one of the guides here at the Bosworth Heritage Site. There's about 8 or 9 of us, and I've been doing it now for about 2 years. Prior to that, 20 years in the Australian Army, and prior to that, 24 years in the British Army.
Oh, wow.
So I've sort of retired from military service full-time and now doing this to sort of keep my mind straight. And it's good fun. You get out and about, public at the weekends, school children during the week, helping to educate the children, helping to entertain the adults.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's some really important events go on here through the year that dear listeners, you may want to know more about. And we'll talk about those at the end of our chat here today to make sure people know how to come and find you and what's going on here. So, Harry, I've just come from St James's Church in Sutton Chaney, where it's said that Richard heard Mass. Was that on the morning of the battle itself?
It would have been on the morning of the battle, and if we're able to look in sort of that direction, you'll see the farmer's barn with the gap in the trees, and the left-hand side of the gap is actually the church steeple of that said church. So not that far from here at all. And where we're stood is known as Ambion Hill, and Ambion is an Old English word meaning one tree. So there were no trees here. And again, if we look in that sort of general direction, so we're looking more towards the west, we can see another church, and that's the church of Market Bosworth. And if you were stood in that church on the morning of the battle looking this way, you'd have seen King Richard's army on this hill, Ambion Hill, approximately 10,000 soldiers, including horses, cattle, even women and children and blacksmiths spread across this sort of hill area. Although we say it's a hill, it actually is not a hill. It's actually a ridge that's going in a general direction from where we're stood now over towards my right, and it crosses an ancient Roman road called Fen Lane towards another village called Dadlington. Dadlington's a little bit interesting for us because it's the only place on the battlefield where we believe we have found some human remains that were buried en masse there.
Oh, right, okay. Now, you said something there that sparked a question for me about women, children, blacksmiths and so on. Did they all arrive on the morning or what tended to happen when a battle was brewing?
So what we think happened here is that Henry Tudor lands in the bottom left-hand corner of Wales, roundabouts the 1st of August, and he lands with about 3,000 French mercenaries provided to him by a lady called Anne of France. She's the regent of France at the time, because the King of France is her brother, who's too young. And he's making his way through Wales, flying that big red dragon flag, saying, "Come and fight for Wales." And as he travels through Wales, his army grows and grows. And by the time he gets to the top of Wales, he's now about 5,000 in strength. So he's picked up a couple of thousand Welshmen, including Welsh noblemen. And for our story, a particular interesting one called Rhys ap Thomas. And at the top of Wales, he comes across a road. And the road is well over 1,000 years old by this stage. And it's an ancient Roman road called Watling Street. And Henry Tudor's travelling down Watling Street, and Watling Street leads to London. So he's marching on London. I guess the theory is, take the capital, take the country. King Richard, not a silly man, knew that Henry Tudor was likely to come because Henry had tried it 2 years previously unsuccessfully, but doesn't know which direction. So Henry places himself in the middle of the country in Nottingham. And his spies let him know that Henry Tudor's arrived. Richard sends out his messages to all his noblemen to bring their men to come and join him. And Richard leaves Nottingham on a Roman road, another ancient road over 1,000 years old called the Fosse Way. And people from Leicester will know that quite well. He arrives in Leicester, and I know you've just come from there. And the day before the battle, they leave Leicester in the morning, crossing Bow Bridge, where you've just come from, on the Fosse Way, which then leads to another minor Roman road called Fen Lane. And as I mentioned, Fen Lane earlier is literally 1 mile from where we're standing to my right, and Watling Street is literally 5 miles where we're standing to my left. So the reason we end up having a battle here in the middle of nowhere is a major junction of Roman roads. Henry Tudor couldn't keep going. He's only got an army of about 5,000. It's what he's brought really from France and what he's picked up in Wales. Arguably, he's a one-shot weapon, so he's got to use it wisely. If he kept heading for London down Watling Street, he would expose the rear of his army. And militarily, I suppose that is a very bad thing to do. So he has to turn and face Richard. King Richard's also in a dilemma. He can't wait for more reinforcements, because if he waits, Henry may keep going. And if he gets to London, who now knows what's going to happen? So basically, both are forced to fight the battle here on the 22nd of August in 1485.
Right, OK. Now, I am aware that where we're standing is perhaps not the battle site. Can you talk to us a little bit about why the visitor centre has grown up here? And why not actually on the battle site?
Yes, for 500 years we actually thought the battle was fought here, hence why the Heritage Centre was built. Actually built in 1974, so it's our 50th anniversary this year, and we've got some special occasions for that taking place in September. And when opened in 1974, was opened by the Duke of Gloucester at the time. Part of the challenges of finding the battlefield or identifying exactly where it was is that, firstly, it was a very short battle, we believe, possibly only a couple of hours in the morning, very poorly recorded. The first real documented message was a note sent by a Yorkist knight from the battlefield to York to say the king had been slain in battle at a place called Reed Moor. Again, using Old English, Reedy Marsh. And we know that Shakespeare has a marsh in his Richard III plays. And indeed, there is a marsh at the bottom of this hill where we're standing, Ambion Hill, but it's highly likely that it was a Victorian marsh as part of the canal system.
Oh, OK. So a potential red herring there.
Very much so, I think. And then in 1985 actually, the 500th anniversary of the battle, because it became very topical, a few of the local historians sort of pointed out that the battle wasn't fought here, and there were quite a number of theories behind us towards Leicester, further south towards Tamworth, indeed still here. In about 2009, we got some money from the lottery fund that allowed us to go looking for the battlefield based on what we thought was the strongest theory.
Can I just interrupt there and ask, what was it for the local historians that was making them question the actual site of the battle?
I think when you look at the topography of the ground, and even where we're stood now, I think it is very difficult to imagine 10,000 soldiers with horses stood where we physically are, and then charging just over the top of this little hill here, and there's another army of 5,000 of Henry Tudors, and they end up with a battle about 100 metres from here. It just doesn't seem to make logical sense with the way the ground is laid. So I think that was part of it, and obviously people have their various theories. But there was no other strong evidence at that stage. There was documentation to say that Henry Tudor had based himself roundabouts the small villages in Watling Street, Manchester and places like that. So where's the battlefield? Well, is it between the two, where we are now and there? Well, in 2009, when we received some money from the lottery grant, we employed some metal detectorists. We sent them off in the area we thought was most likely. And I think literally on the last day, they came across a cannonball, then another cannonball, then another cannonball. And they ended up finding well over 30 cannonballs. And with some analysis, it could be seen that A, they were medieval. More importantly, they had been fired. So it wasn't like it was a logistics dump of cannonballs. They then tested the soil where they found the cannonballs, and it was a medieval marsh. They then started finding other bits of metal from the right period, but truthfully, you can find them throughout the country. But then, and later on when we're in the museum, I'll show you, they then found a small silver gilt, about 1 inch in size, white boar. And we know that the white boar is the personal symbol of King Richard. We believe he had about 200 of these made 2 years before the battle for his coronation. It would be thought he would only give them to his most trusted and most loyal men. So if we combine the white boar brooch, the cannonballs, the marsh, and the other bits of metal, I think now with a level of confidence we can say where the battlefield is.
Yeah, that little badge is almost like I was here. Couldn't be better, really, could it? That's such a find. So roughly, we're on right at the top of Ambion Hill now, and if the battle site wasn't here, can we see it from this position? So
where we stood today on a bit of a misty, slightly drizzly day, I think I'll just be able to point it out to you. So we're generally looking south from the top of Ambion Hill where the flagpoles are, and we're looking towards the horizon where the sky meets the land. And if we take a line from the horizon to the trees in front of us, which are literally about 500 metres away, halfway between there appears to be a slightly lighter coloured field, which is about 2 miles as the crow flies from here, and that is where we believe the centre of the battlefield is. But if we continue to look that way, and again we take ourselves to the horizon, which is about 7 miles from here, come towards us by 2 miles, from right to left is running Watling Street. So Henry Tudor has come down from the right, which is heading towards Wales. The left is taking us towards London. And again, if we look towards our left, there's a tree line here that's going at an angle, and 1 mile to the left of that, but parallel, is Fen Lane. And if we imagine Fen Lane going in that direction, Watling Street coming from my right, you can now see that that green field I pointed out is almost like a junction, and that's where they meet. So we believe that the night before the battle, King Richard's army would be here on this ridge, Ambion Hill as we call it, spreading towards Fen Lane, across towards the east. Henry Tudor's army is down in the small villages around Watling Street. They would have been able to see each other's campfires. There would have been spies around, obviously, trying to identify the size of each other's army. They would have been able to smell the stew cooking on the stove that evening.
Wow, that's an amazing thought. So the morning of the 22nd dawns. What are the first events unfolding? Who kicks it all off, even?
I think there's a number of schools of thought. I think a view is Henry Tudor actually does make the first move by coming off Watling Street to face Richard III. As mentioned earlier, if he kept going, he would expose the rear of his army, which would be a bad thing to do militarily. So he turns to face King Richard. King Richard's got his army. It's broke up into a number of guards, as they call it. His vanguard, so the main part of his army, is being commanded by a 64-year-old gentleman, John Howard, the Duke of Norfolk. Yes, elderly, but vastly experienced, fought in a number of battles throughout the War of the Roses. And we believe he's on Richard's right flank. On his left flank, he has Henry Percy, the Earl of Northumberland, and Richard somewhere in the centre with his own personal army, mainly sort of cavalry. Facing him, he's got Henry Tudor. Probably worth noting, it's probably Henry Tudor's first ever battle. He's 28 years of age. He's been in effectively exile for the last 14 years. He's arrived at the battlefield with his 3,000 French mercenaries, roughly 2,000 Welsh peasants, farmers and noblemen. He's got some Lancastrian noblemen that have been with him for quite a number of years in exile with him. Indeed, now he's even got some Yorkists with him. And these are people who've been with him for the last 2 years who are possibly part of the Buckingham revolt when Henry Tudor first tried to make an invasion that all went badly wrong because of English weather, no doubt. And Henry's facing, and his main commander is a guy called John de Vere, the Earl of Oxford. Again, a vastly experienced commander, fought at Barnet against Hastings, actually. Shouldn't really be the Earl at this stage. His father was the Earl, and he had an elder brother, but the Yorkists executed both. So the Earl of Oxford is probably really out for some form of vengeance today. What we think is the Earl of Oxford is coming forward first. He gets engaged by cannon. We know that King Richard has cannon because prior to the battle he sends a message down to the Royal Arsenal, which is at the Tower of London, and cannon is brought forward. And again, we have found cannonballs on the battlefield. Although I must add, we've found cannonballs where they landed. We can't say where they were fired from. So are they Tudor cannon or are they Yorkist cannon? Well, as mentioned, we know that King Richard does have cannon, but what about Henry Tudor? I think a lot of military people would say highly unlikely he would have brought it from France and dragged it all the way through Wales. However, on Watling Street, heading towards London, there are a number of significant towns that had castles, Shrewsbury, and not far from here, Kenilworth, and they would have had cannon. And I think it's not wrong to imagine that of those 3,000 French mercenaries, they would have had the skill to use cannon. So I think it'd probably be fair to say that both sides had cannon. Earl of Oxford is starting to head towards Ambion Hill, is engaged by cannon, probably pushes him to his left, engaged by archers, pushes him further left, comes across the marsh, pushes him even further left off the line of march. What I think then happens is that King Richard commands the Duke of Norfolk to go and engage the Earl. The Duke of Norfolk goes forward. Not hard to imagine as they approached each other. They said, "Good morning, cousin." The Earl of Oxford's mother is a first cousin to the Duke of Norfolk. Okay. And then battle sort of commences. A bit of a stalemate, I think, to begin with. It's said by Oxford, bearing in mind he was the winner. So, the winner always gets to write history. That Oxford commands his men to effectively step back. They form what is called the famous Oxford wedge, and they move back forward into the battle. And they start to take superiority over the Duke's men.
Can you just explain what the Oxford wedge is and why it's so effective?
I think what it really means, because in your mind you start to think, oh, they've all stepped back and they've formed like an arrowhead. I think what he really does is he commands his men to be no more than a certain distance from their flag bearers, which maintains a concentration of force in those particular areas. So when they go forward, you have this mass concentrated against the Duke's men, which I think takes them slightly by surprise. That's what we believe happens. There are other things happening at the same time on the battlefield. At this stage, King Richard has got Lord Thomas Stanley's son as a hostage. King Richard sends a message to Lord Thomas Stanley saying, come and join me now or I'll execute your son.
So where's Thomas Stanley at this point from where we're standing? We're facing the battlefield off a couple of miles away.
Yeah, so we're looking south from Ambion Hill and down towards where the battlefield is. If we look across to our left, on a clear day, there is a village called Stoke Golding. And that's where we believe the Stanley brothers, with an army of about 5,000, were based, betwixt, as in between, the two armies. It makes some sense because shortly after the battle, there's an area in Stoke Golding that gets called Crown Hill. Not difficult to imagine, that's where Lord Thomas Stanley, now stepfather to a king, crowns Henry Tudor. But again, interestingly, when I mentioned that we're not really on a hill, we're on a ridge, the ridge and the contour line that we're currently on bends in a curve, as in a ridge, all the way round to Stoke Golding. So the Stanleys are looking down into the battlefield like we are looking down into the battlefield.
Right.
We're on the high ground, the Stanleys are on the high ground, Tudor and his army are in the low open ground heading towards us.
And can you, for those people who maybe not quite so familiar with the story, who were the Stanleys and why were they important at this point?
So the Stanleys are a wealthy merchant family. They made their wealth, I believe, sort of during the period of the 100 Years' War in sponsoring Edward III because he needed money. It brought them to fame. Lord Thomas Stanley at this stage is now the High Constable of England. Think Prime Minister, I suppose. So he's got that very important position. Created High Constable by King Richard. So he's actually sworn his oath and his allegiance to King Richard. However, he's married to a lady called Lady Margaret Beaufort, who happens to be the mother of Henry Tudor. So Henry Tudor is his stepson. So his loyalties are torn. Does he fight for his king and his lord, who he's sworn his oath and allegiance to, who has made him the High Constable of England, or does he fight for his stepson?
And I want to ask your opinion, as he's standing there on the ridge, looking down on the battlefield, do you think he's made up his mind before he gets here who he's going to throw his lot in with? Or do you genuinely think he's hedging his bets and waiting to see what happens?
There's always an alternative story throughout the War of the Roses. And one of the alternative stories is he was never here. There is a story that after the battle, some months later, both Stanley brothers have an audience with the Pope. When asked, when did you first meet Henry Tudor? Lord Thomas Stanley says after the battle, whereas his younger brother, William Stanley, says before the battle, which does make him clearly a traitor and indicates that William Stanley was going to join the side of Henry Tudor to begin with. Henry Tudor's also got another couple of commanders with him, though. He's got another guy called Savage. Savage's mum is the sister of the Stanley boys.
Okay. Everybody's interrelated at this time. Yeah. It's incredible, yeah. Uh-huh.
Another commander he has is a guy called Talbot. And Talbot's auntie is possibly the lady that Edward IV was pre-contracted to marriage to. And maybe the whole reason why we're here.
Yeah. Well, I mean, actually, we haven't touched on that in this story as to why Richard, and this is my opinion, essentially seized and took the throne from Edward IV's two young sons. Maybe you could just touch on that for a moment, since you've brought it up.
Yeah, I mean, Richard is made the sort of the protector of the young king, Edward V, after his father passes away. But Edward V doesn't live in London with his parents. He lives out on the Welsh marches. And he's there with his uncle, his mother's brother, and also with his half-brother, his mother's youngest son from her first marriage, and they're making their way to London for the coronation. Richard is like the commander of the North, based up in York. He gets a message from Lord Hastings, we believe, who's a very, very close friend of Edward IV, to make his way to London quickly, for whatever reasons. They meet up halfway. Apparently they have a very good dinner. Breakfast doesn't go so well. And Richard, Duke of Gloucester at this stage, arrests the Lord Rivers, and young Grey sends them north and now has custody of the young king. Takes him to London, places him in the Tower of London, which is not unusual. The Tower of London is a royal palace, and most kings spent their nights before their coronation in that palace. Meanwhile, though, Elizabeth Woodville, the mother of the young king, with the king's younger brother and sisters, has gone into sanctuary in Westminster Abbey. So they were obviously suspecting something at this stage. Coronation's postponed more than once. Something interestingly happens that we find difficult to sometimes understand, that Richard and his supporters convince Elizabeth Woodville to release the younger boy, who's also called Richard, to assist with his elder brother's coronation. And now Uncle Richard has the princes in the tower, hence where the expression comes from. I guess technically that's not quite correct, because he doesn't have two princes in the tower. He has a king and a prince. And then there is an announcement, and the announcement effectively is that the boys are illegitimate, in that their father had a pre-contracted marriage, possibly to this lady called, I think, Eleanor Talbot, and her nephew now is at this battle.
Wow. Well, thank you. That was a long story, very well summarised, so thank you for that. So in terms of the unfolding battle, do we need to move on to another place to? We can do a bit
of a walk though, this time.
That's all right. We're going downhill, right? Okay. So the whole site here with the Heritage Centre covers what sort of area of interest?
I guess if you take the sort of the longer walk but remain on the site, it's going to be about 2.5 kilometres, the walk around. But in September, we are going to do what we call the long walk, where basically we follow roughly the route of King Richard right the way down to the centre of the battlefield, and then we loop all the way back again. But that's about a 7 or 8 hour walk, so it requires people with a relative level of sort of fitness and some decent footwear. We do stop at a pub on the way, I think in Stoke Golding, not far from Crown Hill, and Stoke Golding will tell you that they are the birthplace of the Tudors.
Yes, it's there on the sign, isn't it, as you drive into the village?
We've moved down to this structure here that looks a little bit like a pyramid, but actually it's what we call a cairn. Built initially in the Victorian period, refurbished in the early 1900s, maintained by the Richard III Society. They've been around for about a good 100 years now, really trying to clear King Richard's name.
Yes.
And we can see on the left-hand side, we have rose bushes. They're in flower at the moment. They're white because King Richard is a Yorkist prince. And it's a natural well. And if we listen, we can hear the water flowing. And regularly when I come here on the anniversary of the battle or on his birthday, the 2nd of October, you'll see white roses have been placed there.
Nice, lovely.
And again, one of these legends that says that, that King Richard drank from this well on the morning of the battle, probably highly unlikely. Imagining that in this area we are, there has been up to 10,000 soldiers with their horses and even livestock, probably not water to drink. Particularly if you think back to people like Henry V, who dies from drinking dirty water, dysentery. And again, the battlefield is not actually here. It's a good 2 miles away to our right. So probably a bit of legend.
Nice legend, nice story, yeah. But we're going to continue our walk. We're actually heading towards, aren't we?
We're heading towards the battlefield, and we'll get as close as we can on today's walk. One of the challenges that we have here with walking on the actual battlefield is that there is a right-of-way, but it is on private land by a couple of local landowners, but there's no parking down there. Hence, when we do our long walk in September, it is a good 6 or 7 hour walk because you have to walk a long way to get to the battlefield because there's no way you can actually park.
I must say, I've walked the whole circuit many times over the years. It's a lovely walk on a nice day. It
is. We've got some nice sort of some signage that gives some sort of description to follow along with the story. You can pick up the map in the Heritage Centre before you start off. Use that as your sort of starting point and do a nice sort of walk. It's trying to imagine in your mind an army of up to, say, 10,000, split into various sort of different groupings. But when it's moving forward, its frontage is probably, at least over a mile wide, at least.
Wow.
The battle's taking place towards the end of August. The harvest has been done. The way they ploughed the fields in those days was a lot of what they called ridge and furrow. That's all been fairly clear, so it's very, very open ground. Most of the trees that we can see today would not have been here. Right. So they would have been able to see great sort of distances because we've come from that high ground, that ridge, down now onto the flat, open, what would have been meadows, as per our...
So we can see in front of us, yes, because we've come down here and there are some information boards, including a visual depiction of what the landscape would have looked like. So just to reiterate, this very, very open landscape with the village of Stoke Golding.
In fact, if we walk around here...
Yes.
There's the church of Stoke Golding there.
Ah, yes, I can see.
And again, it's trying to think because the trees make it slightly difficult for us, but we can see that church is on a bit of high ground. We've just come off the high ground. So imagine there's a ridge line going all the way like that behind us. Over at Stoke Golding, you've got the Stanleys looking down into this bowl. We've been up at the top looking down into this bowl, and all the fighting is going to take place basically between where we are now and that sort of direction just to the right of Stoke Golding.
So what time is it at this point when the two armies finally meet in battle?
We think mid-morning, and the fight only goes for a couple of hours. Going back to our story, so we've got a fight taking place between the two cousins, the Earl of Oxford and the Duke of Norfolk. As mentioned, we think Oxford has got the better hand by now. He's done his famous Oxford wedge. Across the battlefield, Henry Tudor is seen, possibly with about maybe 50 of his knights, making his way towards Stoke Golding. He's heading, we believe, towards his stepfather, maybe saying, come and join me now. King Richard and his close retinue of knights, maybe a couple of hundred, he basically rolls the dice. He can see Henry Tudor's exposed. He does his famous cavalry charge. They clash into each other. King Richard is said to personally kill Henry Tudor's standard bearer and also unhorse a giant of a man called John Cheney, who came in well over sort of about 6'3", 6'4". At this point, William Stanley decides to join the battle, and he joins the battle on the side of Henry Tudor. With that extra reinforcement, it pushes everybody towards the marsh. King Richard is unhorsed and is slain. But battle is not over. In front of us now, in this open ground that we can see, is the Earl of Oxford has killed the Duke, maybe not personally, and those other two characters I mentioned earlier, Savage and Talbot, have joined Oxford and are now chasing back the Duke's men in rout. And most of the fighting probably took place in these fields that we can see now.
Right, literally right in front of where we're standing.
But at the end of the battle.
Right, okay, yeah. So, first of all, a couple of questions. Is a 2-hour battle unusual? Was it unusually short?
I think throughout the War of the Roses, there's numerous battles, about 18 in total. Some very, very short skirmishes, then some that took all day, like Towton would be a good example. Wakefield, where the Duke of York is killed, is probably, again, another very, very short one. I think what happens on this battle is that it's Richard who decides to, in his mind, probably take the initiative, do his charge early. We believe he has asked or ordered, because he is the king, Henry Percy to go and assist the Duke. But Henry Percy does not move throughout the battle. And there's always been a question of why is that? If Henry Percy and his army is on the left of King Richard, so in that direction for us, I believe there's a number of reasons why he hasn't joined the battle. You could say, well, is he a traitor? Well, after the battle, he is captured. He's imprisoned for a lengthy period, which is not the way you would treat somebody if they were trying to support you. Is he a coward? Well, he's fought in previous battles and shown his bravery. Is it he can't physically move because the marsh is in the way? Or is it he can see where the Stanleys are because he's on the left, Stoke Golding's on the left, nobody knows what the Stanleys are going to do. If he moves, he's going to expose King Richard's left flank and rear, which militarily would be a bad thing, so he fixes and stays to his ground. Or is he hedging his bets and waiting to see what happens? Yeah. I think what does happen, he's probably caught by surprise slightly when King Richard does his charge, and it's King Richard's off, down the hill, with maybe a couple of hundred of his knights, lots of charging, lots of armour being rattled, a lot of people caught by surprise, but that's probably the point of the charge, is to catch Henry Tudor by surprise.
So are we saying that Richard was undoubtedly courageous, possibly a little bit rash, but maybe not? It's just the fact that they got pushed into the marsh, and then of course the Stanleys joined the fray. So just unlucky, maybe. What's your military perspective on that particular move?
I think the bit that sometimes we don't find difficult to understand is when King Richard, so it says, personally kills Henry Tudor's standard bearer. Normally, your standard bearer would be within a couple of metres of you, a guy called William Brandon. So how does Richard hit William Brandon and miss Henry Tudor? From my military sort of thinking is that at this stage, Henry Tudor is not standing still. Now, if you've got a group of 50 of you on horseback heading towards your stepfather, and there's maybe up to 200 coming charging towards you, you're not standing still at this stage. They're moving as quickly as they can. And in that confusion, that fog of war, that complete mix-up, Richard hits Brandon, then unhorses Cheney. Henry's personal guard get as close to him as possible. I believe Henry would be physically probably quite frightened at this stage. He's never fought a battle in his life, whereas we know Richard has. And then the overwhelming forces, when William Stanley decides to join the battle, just pushes everybody, and the outcome is as history shows us.
And how many people died that day?
So again, an unknown, possibly as many as 1,000 on King Richard's side. And a lot of that is not down in the marsh. A lot of that is taking place in front of us, with the Duke's men being slaughtered in the rout by the Earl of Oxford. On Henry Tudor's side, maybe as few as just a couple of hundred. But as mentioned previously, we've never found any human remains on the battlefield, unlike at Towton, unlike at Stoke Field. What we have recorded is human remains being found in a small church in a village called Dadlington, which is about 2 miles from here, over to our left. Young men from the medieval period with the type of injuries that we see from Towton and Stoke Field. And we know that Henry Tudor gave money to the church in Dadlington for prayers to be said. So highly likely that they are victims from the battle.
Now, you mentioned a name that I'm quite familiar with from my travels through Wales, and that's Rhys ap Thomas. Mm-hmm. So he's said, isn't he, if I have the right man, to have personally killed Richard III.
So Rhys ap Thomas, a Welsh nobleman who should have been loyal to Richard, should have been protecting the entrance to Wales, and decides to join the Henry Tudor camp. It's said he has a personal dilemma that because he's sworn his loyalty to Richard, he needs to find a way out of it. And a priest sort of says to him, you know, if Henry Tudor's army walks over you, then you are okay. And supposedly he just stands under a bridge, allows Henry Tudor's army to go over him, and therefore his oath has been cleared. After the battle, Rhys ap Thomas gets an enormous amount of recognition, becomes a Knight of the Garter, the highest knighthood in the land, the protector of Wales, effectively, a great deal of wealth. An enormous amount is given to him, and you have to imagine why. We know he's a Welshman. We know he brings a lot of Welshmen with him. We know one of the weapons that the Welsh would have used would have been the halberd, a long stick with an axe-like implement on the end. We know that King Richard, from his skeletal remains, the killing wounds were done by a heavy clefted weapon, like a halberd. There's a poem after the battle, several months later, and in that poem it says that Rhys ap Thomas shaved the boar's head.
Yeah,
so endeth the life of King Richard III. Did he personally cleft the weapon? I don't think it really matters. Was it his men? Well, he gets the recognition.
Yeah, and I would just add, dear listeners, that if you are around in South Wales, there is Carew Castle, which was the main seat of Rhys ap Thomas. You can still go and see the remains of that. And I've also done a write-up of his tomb. I believe, if I remember rightly, he's buried in Carmarthen, in the church in Carmarthen, and you can still see his rather weather-worn tomb. And I have done a write-up of that for my membership. And obviously you can find out more information about the membership via my links in the description associated with this podcast. So what happens now to Richard? Fairly awful things, really.
So Richard is found, obviously, on the battlefield. He's stripped off his armour. Naked, he's put on a horse to be taken back into Leicester. He has a couple of wounds on his body that are slightly more difficult to describe how they came about. One of them is to a rib on the rear of his back, I think on the right-hand side, which would have been fully protected by plate armour. So possibly that wound has happened post-mortem. He's naked on a horse, and it's a humiliation-type wound. He has another wound that's a very, very deep wound, I believe, into his right pelvis, so right through his right buttock. Again, a school of thought is it's post-mortem, he's naked on the back of a horse, and somebody's just stabbed him in the bum. However, we've had the reenactors here, and I think not last year, the year before, and they came up with their own theory on the various wounds. And it is only a theory. But their theory, and it is plausible, is the wound through his right buttock is actually one of the first wounds. Because when we go into the museum and we see the mannequin of King Richard, the only part of your body that's not protected by armour is the back of your legs and your buttocks, because they're on the horse. But if you're fighting somebody and you're on a horse and they're on the ground, you have to step into your stirrups and you expose your behind. And if there's somebody else behind you, they could have thrust upwards. The depth of that wound would have been enormously painful. He would have lost a lot of blood, and that in itself would likely have unhorsed him. Yeah. We don't know the sequence of the wounds. No, we just know he has several on him. Some of them can be attributed with different types of weapon. But the order they were done in and the chaos that was taking place that day, we don't know. However, the killing wounds on him are both to the back of his head. The heavy clefted weapon, possibly a halberd, penetrates into his brain by about 2 inches. It would have killed him almost instantly. And then there's another wound that goes through the back of his head all the way through his skull, maybe a sword or the tip of a halberd that again would have killed him instantly.
Yeah, so it was very quick end when it actually came.
Yeah.
Oh, God, gruesome to think
But
about.
again, not unlike when you look at some of the skeletal remains from Towton or from Stoke Field, lots and lots of horrific injuries around the head. Again, because they're wearing so much armour below the neckline.
Yeah.
And once your helmet is gone, you're in a lot of trouble.
And so there is Henry, the new King of England. And
So we believe Richard was wearing a small crown on his helmet, a cornet type thing. Again, legend said it's found in a bush. It's presented to Henry Tudor's stepfather, Lord Thomas Stanley, who then crowns his stepson as King Henry VII of England. Over, we think, at Stoke Golding on a place now called Crown Hill.
fantastic. What a great story. And then, of course, how long, I guess Henry sets off fairly promptly back to Leicester with King Richard's body?
There's possibly a story. They have lunch first.
Oh, really? How civilised.
Up by Stoke Golding. And again, that makes a little bit of sense in that if Lord Thomas Stanley crowns his stepson there, he's doing it from where his camp was before the battle. Yeah. They have lunch because the battle took place mid-morning,
yeah.
and then they go into Leicester.
Yeah.
And it's recorded that they arrive in Leicester in late afternoon.
Well, we're going to rejoin the story of King Richard's body being brought back into Leicester by Henry Tudor shortly. But I really would like to hear about any particular events that you have either that happen on an annual basis here, because I know there is at least one big event that you'd like our audience to hear about. And also, how can people find out more about what's going on here?
So we advertise most of what we do through our website, which can be found, and I know you'll put a link to that on later.
Indeed.
We're also on TripAdvisor, so you can find us on TripAdvisor if you want to go down that path. We hold a variety of events throughout the year. The big one, as you were alluding to, is our big festival that takes place in one of the weekends closest to the battle. All the reenactors will be here. It'll be 2 full days of medieval festival, food, wine, stores. There'll be an encampment where people will be dressed up and live there for 2 days. Really, really enthusiastic. Some of the reenactors are there. But throughout the year, we get reenactors who come here, and they do a weekend here, and you can come and they'll explain everything to you, what they believe took place during that period. They not only dress up, they cook in that manner, they'll show some of the weaponry. We educate children throughout the academic year, from as young as about 7 or 8, right the way up to university, normally during the weekdays. But at the weekends, we do public walks for the paying public. During the summer months, 2 walks a day on a Saturday and Sunday. And this September, because it's our 50th anniversary of the centre, we're doing a number of activities in September. And one of those activities will be the long battlefield walk, which will be several hours. We have various theatre groups that come here. And I think this year we're going to be doing Beauty and the Beast, so you can sit in the field and watch that. But we're not only all about the Battle of Bosworth. This is also a Roman site, hence the Roman road that both the Yorkists and the Tudors used to get here. And we believe there was a Roman temple on this site. So we also do a lot of education for Romans. So if you have an interest in Romans, Boadicea used Watling Street. Henry Tudor used Watling Street. So yes, there's a lot going on throughout the year. I'd probably emphasise that we are very much a educational and hands-on institution. So there's a lot to actually do from very young children right up to adults. And we have a very excellent cafe here that maybe we'll have some lunch in later.
I think so. Thank you so much for that. And yes, I would reiterate that of course, I mentioned it earlier, but there is a show notes page associated with this podcast. So all the links that you hear mentioned throughout my travels for this podcast will be included there. So do check that out. And I have yet to make the annual celebration. So I've been meaning to do this for years and something always gets in the way. So I'm just hoping that sometime soon I'll be able to get along. Well, with that, you were talking about Richard's interment, of course, in Leicester. Then there's a whole story about the aftermath of the Battle of Bosworth and what happened to Richard when he was taken back. And of course, there is the final chapter of that, which is relatively recent rediscovery. So what we're going to do now is we're going to travel back to Leicester and we're going to meet up again with Steve, who is going to continue and in fact complete our story. So join me there.
Thank you for tuning in to today's episode of the Tudor History and Travel Show. If you've loved the show, please take a moment to subscribe, like and rate this podcast so that we can spread the Tudor love. Until next time, my friends, all that remains for me to say is happy time travelling.